Welcome, everybody, to the third episode of the Paleoconnection. I'm Brandon, and once again, I'm joined by my partner, Verv. We have no guests today, but we will be taking on the topic of fentanyl, specifically the drug war and the effect that fentanyl has had on America and the global connections to this new deadly drug. This drug is also slightly connected to last week's episode because George Floyd did have it in his system, and I believe that perhaps was one of the sparks to choose this topic for this week. So with that being said, let's turn it over to my partner Verv, and he's going to give a bit of a background on the history of the drug fentanyl.
That's right. So fentanyl is a little bit unique in the sense that it was developed by a company and is purely a manufactured drug, unlike things like cocaine or crack or even LSD, which have a very strong component that goes back to nature. This is really something that was developed in a lab by a company called Janssen Pharmaceutica in 1959. At that time, it was primarily used as an anesthetic and pain reliever for medical purposes. During the 60s, fentanyl started to be used as an intravenous anesthetic by the name of Sublimase. And it wasn't really until the mid-1990s that the fentanyl patch was introduced and could be used as a treatment for chronic pain, usually pain that would fall into the category of moderate to severe. And eventually, after the introduction of the patch, they also developed other forms of delivery, such as the Actique lollipop, which is basically a lozenge on a handle. It really does look like a lollipop, and it's for oral consumption. So, generally speaking, its legitimate use is for controlling moderate to severe pain. And some of the other things they have for it, would you like to cover those, Brandon?
Yeah, sure. So there's a nasal spray, as you mentioned, lozenges. There's also tablets. Typically these types of tablets and nasal sprays and patches are used for cancer patients. People who are dealing with extreme pain, chronic pain, that need opioids. And originally, this opioid, fentanyl, and a few others were actually developed with the addictive properties in mind. They originally thought that they were a good substitute for morphine and some of the other opioids that people were addicted to, but as we'll find out soon, that they're way more addicting than the original pain relievers like morphine. But basically, the thing here is that this is a legitimate drug, right? This is a drug that has medical purposes. It's used all around the world for pain relief and for cancer patients. The problem is when it, of course, is being used illegally, which is why we're getting so many overdoses, which we'll talk about in a little bit in the future of the show. You want to talk about some of the street names, Verv?
Sure. I would also like to make a quick observation that when it does come to a lot of medicine, people's bodies react differently. So the great diversity that we do have of all of these different painkillers and such is really a blessing, because some people, they can use a painkiller or a drug for a certain amount of time, and then they become too used to it and no longer helps with their chronic pain, or just one specific thing works better for them. So being able to have a great diversity of painkillers out there like fentanyl is a good thing, and it's really a shame that they end up being chronically abused.
Yeah.
And having said that, it does have all of the usual fun street names a drug has. I don't know which of these are, really widely in use, but to start us off, we have kind of a patriotic name, Apache.
Maybe that's used in the southwest of the U.S., perhaps.
Sure, yeah, yeah. And then we get, a little bit to the foreign. We got China Girl, Chinatown, probably going back to the Chinese connection.
Yeah.
We got Dance Fever, Friend, Goodfellas, Great Bear. That's a unique one.
Yeah.
I mean, we got, He-Man, Jackpot, King Ivory, Murder 8, and Tango and Cash. You notice as we go down the list there, it becomes a little bit less, what's the word? Less sensible.
Yeah. My personal favorite is Friend.
Yeah.
Just keep it very simple.
Yeah.
Dance Fever, I don't quite understand. What's your favorite?
Right. I really liked Great Bear because it just made me think of like some shamanistic type thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
yeah. So some of the common effects from taking fentanyl. So I guess you might be asking, well, why abuse it? This is a pain reliever. Well, the reason why people do abuse it is because it does give you an intense short-term high. It relaxes you and sedates you. Now, I've never taken it myself, so I can't really attest to how this would actually feel, but getting a short-term high and feeling relaxed and sedated, temporary feelings of euphoria, along with pain relief, if you want that as well. Those are some common reasons why people do take drugs. So fentanyl gives you that. Now, some of the things that are other effects that maybe you don't want when you take it, you get sweating, itchiness, nausea. Here's the big one: slowed respiration. That's actually the thing that ends up killing most people who overdose on fentanyl. Your breaths per minute can go down to as low as 5 or 6, which ends up not getting, your body does not get enough oxygen because of that, and you end up dying. So that slowed respiration is really the killer there. But reduced blood pressure, fainting, seizures, and of course death when overdosed on are all possibilities and effects from taking fentanyl.
Right. One of the other unique characteristics of this drug is how small it is. So prescriptions of fentanyl are dosed in micrograms, and only a very small dose can really put you off. For example, 500 milligrams of Tylenol or 25 milligrams of Benadryl is what you would normally take. But when we are dealing with fentanyl, something as small as 2 milligrams can be a lethal dose for most people. As you see, we got some interesting pictures here of how little people could take and it would be lethal for them.
Yeah, you could really see in that picture, I don't know what the technical term would be, a crystal or whatever they call that, but like, let's say you take away just one of those crystals, you perhaps have a normal dosage to get high. You add 1 or 2 more, you're dead. And
right.
I mean, this is so tiny. We got a picture of a penny next to him, so you can see how, just especially if you don't really know what you're doing and you're kind of new to this, you could overdose very easily, and that is really the reason why there has been so many overdoses. People typically don't want to overdose on a drug and kill themselves. They want the high, but there's just so many overdoses because of the microgram dose that you need to take to actually get high.
Right, and there's very famous drugs like morphine that they're famous for their addictiveness, and this is 10,000 times stronger than the very potent and addictive morphine. Excuse me, I'm talking now about carfentanil, which is an analog of fentanyl. So a specific subgenre of, gosh, I'm just not picking words right today. A specific analog of fentanyl is 10,000 times stronger than morphine. And carfentanil is actually used as a tranquilizer for elephants. So basically, we're talking about animals that weigh over 15,000 pounds. They use this to knock them out, and other people are apparently using it to get high. And you see here in the picture just how little of this has to be used compared to what has always been, in my mind, one of the most deadly drugs, heroin.
Hmm. Yeah, the carfentanil obviously not quite as prevalent as fentanyl is, but it is out there. You know, people are getting high on elephant tranquilizers. Believe it or not, that's what that's how far we've gone as a society. Um, and part of the dangerous part about this is that emergency responders who are going to places, drug houses, places where laboratories where they're making fentanyl or carfentanil, other versions of fentanyl, they could actually get these small doses on their skin or on their uniforms. Or I was watching a YouTube video where a couple of cops, they had a baggie of fentanyl, and one of them closed the baggie. He wasn't being very cautious in how he closed the baggie, and kind of a puff of it kind of came out of the baggie, and him and his partner ended up overdosing on it. Now, they didn't die, but they had to receive medical attention because the doses are so dangerous that you have to use biohazard equipment with full oxygen tanks when you go and raid one of these houses or laboratories that's producing this stuff.
And you imagine that even the guys who make it themselves, the guys who sell it, of course, they're not complete idiots. They are going to be careful, but it seems doubtful that they'd be walking around with hazmat suits everywhere. So just think about the threat that it poses to users and manufacturers, even when it's just in transportation or storage.
Exactly. And I also heard a couple cases where, kids, again, a little bit of the fentanyl is left, residue somewhere. Some of these dealers or producers have kids. The residue gets on the kids' fingers somehow, and the kids can end up dying from this because, again, it's so small you can't possibly even notice it, even if you're trying to be super careful.
Right. Another kind of just off the cuff thought on this is you hear about, I think they call them hot shots, when someone has an enemy they want to get rid of. They just give them an undiluted cut of the drug they usually take, and that's enough to just immediately kill them. And it's very hard to trace. It's like basically inducing an overdose on your enemy, right? Imagine how easy that could be with this. And then just imagine scenarios where you got a guy, he doesn't even really want to kill anybody, but he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's trying to dilute and lace his fentanyl with other things. And, the end result is you could have dozens of people dying from someone who just does not know what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that, what you were talking there with lacing the fentanyl into heroin or other drugs, that is a common practice. Again, you have no idea how much fentanyl you're actually getting. So let's say you want to buy heroin, and your dealer does, that he does lace fentanyl in there, and that's something you're expecting, but this time perhaps he laces a little bit too much, or like you said, intentionally, because you guys have a beef or something, and you end up overdosing. So yeah, lacing with fentanyl is a huge issue. Now, if you do overdose on fentanyl, there's a drug called naloxone. Now, this drug is it's a pretty amazing drug, actually, the way it apparently deals with opioids. They have many different ways to take it. You can get injected by it, or they have a nasal spray even. And I was reading some things online that said even some high schools in the U.S. Have been debating getting these naloxone nasal sprays because the opioid crisis is even hitting high schoolers these days. But yeah, this is a very fast acting counter to the opioids. It works within 3 to 4 minutes. And if you ever do experience somebody who is overdosing on fentanyl, if you have this naloxone, you could definitely save their life just by spraying it up their nose or injecting it into their skin. But one of the problems is that when someone is overdosing on fentanyl and they're rushed to the hospital, it's hard to even know that they're overdosing on fentanyl because, right, they have so little of it actually, in their system, and it's hard to actually even realize for medical personnel to realize that they need to use the naloxone. And when time's ticking, you don't have enough time. When the person's breathing, the breathing is getting shortening, and you don't have the time on your side. And if you don't give them the naloxone when you're supposed to, it's all over.
Right. So let's get into some of the quick and interesting facts that go down to some of the numbers of how this is affecting our country. A 2018 report said that around 80 people a day are actually killed by fentanyl. And this is, of course, just for the United States. And fentanyl use in the U.S. has absolutely surged, pushing the death toll in 2017 to 28,466, 9 times higher than it was in 2013. And it's basically a rise that has been so steep, it's actually driven down the national life expectancy.
Yeah.
Fentanyl, yeah. I mean, that's pretty crazy numbers. We're talking about the average lifespan of over 300 million people being reduced because of fentanyl abuse.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. As I mentioned before, just 2 to 3 milligrams can kill you. First responders are especially at risk. Inhalation or just skin absorption actually is one of the possibilities. Actually, I think you mentioned they have a patch. One of the ways actually that people abuse it is they get a hold of these patches, which are, these are time release patches. They get a hold of the patches and they, of course, manipulate them to get more of the drug at one time,
right.
And then they get high off of it. And here's one of the most interesting things about fentanyl, in my opinion, is that 80% of the pure fentanyl seized by U.S. authorities last year arrived from China. So this is not coming from Colombia, the usual places. Now, it does come from Mexico via China, but most of it's coming from China. China is either sending it through the mail, through websites. So if you're in the U.S., you could visit a Chinese website, and you can have them send you through the mail. Again, we're talking about tiny trace amounts of a powdery substance, right? It's almost impossible with all the mail coming in and out of the U.S. to know that there's these tiny little fentanyl, tablets or powder in these envelopes. And apparently it's so profitable that these Chinese websites, they guarantee that the fentanyl will reach you, and if it does not, you get your money back. So even if the U.S. Customs does seize it, it doesn't matter. You're going to get your money back, and they'll send another package, another envelope in the mail, and you'll get it in probably less than a week. So how do you stop that, right? You got drugs being
Right.
sent through the mail.
And it's really super difficult as well because the profit margins are absolutely nuts on this. A single kilogram can yield somewhere around $1.5 million in profit in the US. And you can pick up that kilogram in China for somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000. So you can compare that with some of the other drugs out there. I believe the number they gave for a kilogram of undiluted heroin was around $80,000 in profit. So we're talking about something that's well over 10, 15 times more profitable than such a big name drug as heroin.
Exactly. And the one of the other big differences, heroin, of course, comes from a natural plant, the poppy plant, correct? And
right,
that requires acreage. That requires lots of land to grow. Fentanyl is made in a laboratory, right, behind closed doors. It's very hard, to, even if you were trying to stop all of these fentanyl labs, it would be impossible because, of course, you could just have them anywhere, right? We've all watched Breaking Bad, right? You can have them in the basement of a dry cleaner or whatnot, and you can't catch all of it. Whereas heroin, other drugs like marijuana, you have to grow this stuff, and police can just take a helicopter up and see a large field, and I guess they could burn it down to get rid of it. It's a little bit harder to
right.
deal with lab produced drugs like this.
Right, and China actually has the second largest pharmaceutical market in the world based on revenue. And so, China's not a country known to be particularly clean and up to standard, and they're also not a country known for, prioritizing health and global partnerships over profits, right? So China's pharmaceutical market being so large and having around $105 billion in revenue in 2014 alone, we're not really going to see a situation where the Chinese government are even working that hard to actually curb the problem. It's way too profitable. Over 5,000 companies are involved in the pharmaceutical market, and that's just a huge number to monitor as well. So even if they did want to actively fight it, it would still be a very monumental task.
Yeah, this is something I kind of wanted to get into, and I guess you can call it a conspiracy theory, but I don't really know if it even is, and that's the fact that, is China, the Chinese government, just intentionally looking the other way, or even aiding and abetting these laboratories in getting these drugs into the U.S.? Because, just think about it. This is a win-win for China. By pushing these opioids into the U.S., you have a major health crisis that the U.S. has to deal with. The U.S. has to spend money, time,
Right.
legislative effort, and people are dying. It's a huge health crisis. And what does China get? Well, they're making money, right? They're just making profit off of this. So I can
certainly a poetic justice if you care about the opium wars from the 1840s and 50s, I think it was.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to mention that almost as a kind of revenge, for the British
Right.
pushing opium into China, and it wreaked havoc on their population. China remembers that. All of East Asia has taken very hard stances on drugs, partially because of that.
Right.
They remember that. They remember how it affected their societies so bad. I just would not doubt if this is a Chinese government spy operation to push as much, of this fentanyl and other opioids into the U.S., get people addicted, profit off of it, and what's the downside for them?
Right. So do you remember there was the really big Vice documentary, I think it was 8 or 9 years ago, about the Russian drug crocodile?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
crocodile. Well, what was in there that really was interesting to me is one of the Russian law enforcement officers they spoke with, someone who was really high up. He just seemed like a really professional, bureaucratic guy. And he said that many people in the very beginning used to actually say, oh, the Arab world and all these other forces are conspiring to get these drugs into Russia to basically control us and profit off of us. Oh, excuse me 1 second. That was my dog. I'm sorry. But he said at first he didn't believe these conspiracies at all. But in the end, he began believing in them because the price of crocodile and all these other drugs in Novosibirsk, where the documentary largely takes place, had dropped to such a level that it seemed like how could anyone even really be making that much money off of it? And so, when you see that China's willing to part with this kind of drug for $3 to $5 a kilogram, and it sells for over $1 million a kilogram in the U.S., that's a little bit suspicious as well. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions, but it does make sense to think that there would be vested interests in getting the fentanyl over to the U.S. and the U.S. suffering as a result of it.
Yeah, well, we do know that China has used the enforcement of fentanyl as a bargaining chip, both with the U.S., Canada, and other countries. And there has been some show trials where China has actually put to death 7 or 8 of these large fentanyl dealers. But just as I said, many people are kind of thinking they are just show trials, right? Putting 7 or 8 people to death, yeah, that's pretty serious. But the amount of laboratories that are producing this, the amount of people that are connected, it's just too many. It's mind-boggling. I don't even know if China could deal with it if they wanted to, and to me, it just doesn't seem like they do want to. In my opinion, they'd be making a mistake if they weren't actually intentionally trying to get this into the U.S. In my opinion, right. As we know, the U.S. and China are in kind of a new Cold War. I'm sure China wants to do everything they can to weaken the U.S. So if they aren't leveraging, this point, I would be very surprised.
Right. Let's also remember that China does not shy away from doing show trials. There was a famous series of events that I believe was 2012, 2013, where they had exported loads of tainted toothpaste and milk, not just in China, but also to Latin America. People had actually died or became disabled. And one of them was a children's toothpaste, I remember, and it turned hundreds of children, gave them brain damage. It varied in severity, but some of them literally, now they will not talk and basically be very mentally disabled their whole lives. And I remember when this happened, they found basically one executive who, as news reports said, just did everything that everyone else did, basically paying off the Chinese FDA and being in bed with other officials just to get his profit margins up. They took one of those guys. They had a 7-day trial, found him guilty, and I believe he was executed within 72 hours. And this was kind of the bone that they threw to the masses, right?
Yeah, it's like, look, we're doing something, but the fact is that it's just obvious that it's not having even a small impact on the actual situation.
I had heard this as well. My uncle, he had remarried to a woman who was from Shanghai, and she was telling me that one of the things they have in China that they have on the news is in the black markets where they sell bootleg fashion products, or back in the day DVDs and CDs. They would do these public raids that they invite the news crews out. Everyone's filming it. The police come and they bust everything. But then all the guys who had all of their products seized and looked distressed on TV, they get a call from the police. Hey, come over here tomorrow. We're going to have all your stuff. You're going to get it all back.
Really? That's interesting.
Yep.
It really is just, that it really is just a just a big show, even for their own citizens.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously we know that the media in China is government controlled, so that kind of stuff doesn't surprise me too much. But I mean, that story just shows you the lengths that they will go to try to appease doubters or people who like, for example, appeasing the US or Canada with the fentanyl problem. They have the show trial, and then afterwards, well, yeah, it's all forgotten again, and then the US or Canada needs to give another concession, and then perhaps they'll do another show trial. But as we know, the supply is not going to stop. It's just going to keep coming.
Right. And when we're talking about something that can make that much money, it would be foolish for you to not be making money off of it if you are even just a private businessman. So even if the top heads of the Chinese Communist Party aren't involved in it, there's simply too much money that is to be made for guys lower down to cover it up and get their cut of everything. And this could go back to the idea that you see from the traditional Spanish system of government, where some of the bureaucrats lower down aren't actually making that much of a salary and are a little bit unhappy, but the guys on top are like, hey man, collect your bribe, be happy with it, right? This could be one of the ways that the top dogs, the top brass in the Chinese Communist Party let the guys lower down, hey, we'll get you a slot with our FDA or with imports and exports, and you'll get your cut from the Chinese pharmaceuticals, and everyone will make some money off of American drug addicts.
Exactly. And from what I've read, at least what China says is that they do not have an opioid crisis in their country. You would think that it would be kind of risky to produce all this fentanyl, because you would think some of it would be ending up in your own country, and perhaps you could have your own opioid crisis.
Right.
But apparently, well, according to China, they do not. Again, you don't know what you can believe there, but drug charges there are much more serious. So maybe they don't have quite a problem with fentanyl. Going back to just switching topics a little bit, going back to the U.S., some of the states that have been hit the hardest, New Hampshire, they have the highest overdose rate in the entire U.S. West Virginia, Massachusetts, Ohio, D.C., Maryland are some of the others. This is mainly an East Coast problem, from what I'm seeing. It does seem to be moving west, but the hardest hit states are all East Coast.
Right, and then you see on the map as well that a lot of the states touching the Great Lakes are also disproportionately affected. And perhaps a little bit surprisingly, once you get to California, which does not have a reputation for disliking drugs, certainly, it is not a problem there.
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, which again it is kind of weird, because if a lot of it is coming from China, and it either directly comes from China through the mail, or they do send it to Mexico and they sell it to cartels, like larger amounts, and then the cartels smuggle it into the U.S. You would think then that the West Coast and perhaps the Southwest would be where you'd be seeing a lot of fentanyl overdoses. But yeah, if you look at the map, maybe they love meth over there still or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it is a little confusing when you think about it. It would be interesting to get a breakdown of how that happens. I guess that maybe the internet sales are playing a really big role in this. Or maybe some of the big players are bringing over so much at a time, because you only need a little to supply a lot, and they just get it up to their centers in the Northeast, and there you go.
Exactly.
Something also interesting to look at is the national drug overdose deaths between 1999 and 2018. You see that right around 2013, it starts to take off a bit. And then from 2015, it's just absolutely skyrocketing with tens of thousands of people having died from this annually.
Yeah.
And it absolutely dwarfs all these other big name drugs such as cocaine and antidepressant abuse and just the prescription opioids. You often hear about the prescription opioid crisis, but
Yeah. Yeah,
not a
that's
lot of
what
Rush Limbaugh's.
yeah, well that's what all the talk was about 10 years ago, the prescription opioids, and I have a bit of a personal story about that. I did have a friend, a childhood friend, who I grew up with, and he ended up overdosing on prescription drugs, and he ended up dying. Now at that time we had grown apart a little bit, but I still went to his funeral, and yeah, that was basically at the time of, well, it was about 2007, 2009 when this prescription opioid crisis was really starting to, you know, get in the news. Everybody was hearing about it. So I guess I have a little bit of a personal experience with that, and then also with other opioids like heroin and whatnot. I also have a family member who ended up getting involved and also overdosing on heroin. Now, luckily, he did not die, but yeah, that was about 10 years ago as well. So I think kind of most people in America, I'm sure maybe you as well, have had this affect us in some way or another, whether it be a family member, a relative, a friend. It's really kind of hit home. Everyone kind of knows somebody who's either addicted or who has overdosed on these drugs.
Right. One of my friend's younger brothers actually died from fentanyl abuse. I just maybe it was 3 years ago, I think. So I mean, pretty much right around the peak of this. And from what I understand about, I don't follow the news too closely in my hometown, but the crime rates have actually been going up. And almost all the time, it's people who are involved in the narcotics trade killing each other, right? So even when people aren't overdosing, this is something that's creating lots of heartache and mayhem all across the U.S.
Yeah, turf wars, that's something that I'm from Chicago suburbs, and weekly in local Chicago news, there's drug dealers and gangbangers dying in Chicago. Again, this is mainly over turf wars and control of drug corners and whatnot. And again, when you see the prices and the money that that you could possibly make, if you're someone who dropped out of high school and you have nowhere to go in life, and you can make millions of dollars off of, just baggies of this drug, fentanyl, right? We're not talking about, you don't need to rent a warehouse and have, 100 kilograms of heroin to be, rich. You just need baggies, like little baggies, right? And you can become a millionaire with this kind of drug. So, yeah, I could totally see why it's causing, more violence.
And who hasn't thought about, making that kind of money? When we're talking about, let's just say, you go to Mexico somewhat frequently for some reason. If you felt down on your luck and in a bad position, knowing that a kilogram can be worth $1 million to $1.5 million. Who hasn't thought, well, I bet I could get 1 kilogram back across the border with me in my car, right? Like it's kind of one of those very tempting things.
Yeah, and again, all you need is with fentanyl, all you need is just a little baggie.
Right.
Not even a kilogram, and you could get a new car at least.
Right, right. Hundreds of thousands of dollars just in a little plastic bag.
Mhm. So where do you want to go next? You want to go to the wider kind of war on drugs a little
Yeah,
bit?
well, maybe one last thing before we go. I found the analog thing quite interesting. So, by analog, again, of course, we mean that it's a different strain, a different type of fentanyl. And this is the sort of thing that can really plague, the lawmakers and the Department of Justice, because if it isn't exactly what is written down in the law, people can say, well, this isn't fentanyl, this is carfentanil, or this is some other thing. And it really brought back the memory of when Senator Marco Rubio went to the town hall meeting after the shooting in Florida at, I think it was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And he pointed out that you can come up with these laws that regulate all of these AR-15 modifications and everything else, but the manufacturers will, within months, just come up with a slightly different thing that isn't explicitly stated in the regulations. And because we're a country that's ruled by laws, it's ruled by the print of the laws, there's not much that you can actually do about it.
Yeah. Well, with guns, especially in the future, things like 3D printing and whatnot will allow people to just produce their own guns. So, yeah, as you're saying, you can never, law enforcement is always going to be a step behind. And it's almost like similar to the analogy with like viruses and antivirus like software for computers. The guys who make the viruses, they're always making new types of viruses. They're always trying, new types of backdoors to get into your system, and then they're discovered by, the antivirus, teams and, large companies, and then they make, an antivirus software to detect that kind of virus, and then, you're safe from it, but then, then it's a cat and mouse game. Well, it's the same thing here. It's the same thing. It's like once law enforcement becomes privy to this new formula, then again, we're talking about lab-made drugs. They can just modify that formula slightly, and then we're back to square one again. And as you can see, that's just not a viable solution to solving this problem. We're never going to be able to legislate our way out of the crisis.
That's right. And you could say that that has been what has happened with the drug war as a whole. Would you like to jump into some of these historic numbers here?
Yeah, so everybody knows that the U.S. has, a major drug problem, and there's been a war on drugs since 1971. When Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs. But when you look at the numbers, it's even surprising to people. You and me have grown up in the U.S. We've been around drugs. We've heard about drugs our entire life. It really is staggering when you actually look at the graphs and the statistics of how bad things are. Some of the graphs, if you look at incarcerations of Americans, you can see in 1970, when the war on drugs, starts, you can see this huge uptick in incarcerated Americans. Now, up until about 1970, there was a slow increase, right? But after 1970, you just see, in the latest numbers here are 2008, but almost 2.5 million Americans incarcerated. And looking at the other graph, you can see that the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the entire world at 666, believe it or not.
What a number.
Yeah. 666 incarcerations per 100,000. Now, that is way above Russia, Rwanda, Brazil, Australia, Spain, China. You can never really trust their numbers, but the U.S. is much, much higher than any other nation, and the U.S. is obviously not a third world country. The U.S. is a first world country, the wealthiest country in the world. So even comparing it to Russia or Rwanda or Brazil doesn't really even do it service, right? Once you compare to Australia, Spain, France, you could really see that the numbers are way, way higher than countries that have similar, GDP per capita.
When you look at the U.S. crime rates for anything, it really is telling that the countries that show up with it are generally, third world countries or the countries that just aren't going to be what you think of as lovely first world states, but not a third world country like Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about this a lot more in the future, I'm sure. I kind of think that the U.S. is a country that naturally should be compared more to a Russia or a Poland when it comes to certain things, because while we have huge parts of the U.S. that very much do resemble the living standards and the first world characteristics of places like England, France, Germany, Sweden, you do go to places like Mississippi or Alabama or some of our inner cities in general, where these have just never been pleasant places to live. And
yeah, and truthfully, the U.S. You can try to find countries to compare the U.S. to, but the U.S. is just so unique in many different factors that even Russia or comparing to Russia or Poland just isn't going to do its service, right? Because the great racial differences, the racial the history of racial problems in the U.S. That kind of thing isn't really present in in Russia.
Not many places.
Yeah.
Latin America could be said to be a place that has always shared, the racially diverse characteristics that the United States has. But it's also such a hard comparison because, of course, their economies have not been anywhere near as developed. But potentially a future episode idea would be taking a look at Argentina, because I've actually heard that Argentina, until sometime around World War II, slightly after, it actually did resemble the U.S. more than it did other Latin American countries. Perhaps that's still one of the more prosperous Latin American countries still, but it certainly isn't a place that you think of comparing with, Italy or France today.
Well, yeah, I mean, Buenos Aires was considered the Paris of the West, or the Western, the New World, I guess it would have been, because I guess France is still the West, but I think it's the Paris of the New World is what they called it. Yeah, Argentina was a very successful country, and things went downhill from there. Yeah, but getting back to some of these graphs, if you look at I think this graph here that shows the addiction rate and the spending on the drug war really shows why it has been such a waste, because you would think that over the years since the drug war started in 1970, you would think that the addiction rate would go down. But you can clearly see the addiction rate has been steady over the past 50 years, while the money spent has just been increasing and increasing. So $1.5 trillion up until 2010. So obviously that number is even higher now. $1.5 trillion spent on the drug war, but the addiction rate has stayed the same. So if that's not, spinning your wheels in the mud, I don't know what is.
Right. This is the perfect illustration of a phenomena where we've created all of these agencies and all of these institutions and given them these budgets, and year after year they have to justify themselves and they want to expand continuously, right? And once you start paying something out, it becomes very difficult to cut it out.
Yeah, exactly. And just to connect this to last week's podcast, this is part of the reason why the police have been so militarized in the U.S. The war on drugs has required the police to, to get more guns, to get, heavy equipment, to raid these drug houses and to make these dangerous traffic stops. The U.S. Police, the police in the U.S. have been forced to be militarized to, take part in this war on drugs. Even though it's not a war, they have had to militarize themselves to go after the drug dealers and whatnot, because they defend themselves. So possibly one of the solutions, for police brutality and to stop, more senseless killings, is to legalize all drugs. And if we did that, I was really thinking about this. If we did that, then, one of the other consequences of that would be police don't really need to, mess with citizens on traffic stops anymore. That's one of the biggest issues in the U.S., and I really started noticing it more when I came to Korea. The police in Korea don't really pull you over, and do a traffic stop. But in the U.S., traffic stops and searching for drugs has become, just one of the routine things that cops do on a daily basis. We would get rid of all of that. We would get rid of all of the militarization that's required to bust these, drug houses. And I think the society would be better off for it. What do you think about that, Verv?
I think that's generally true. I think, though, you could run into some other issues with if drugs were just really all that open. Of course, that wouldn't mean that, say, the average middle-class guy would come home from work and be like, oh, let's try out some meth. Of course that wouldn't happen, but you might also run into the problem where people who are on the lower end of things, if it wasn't illegal, they might be more willing to take it up and become addicted and fall into that kind of lapse. I'd also certainly worry about the situation if we introduce universal basic income, right?
Mm.
But,
Yeah.
Generally speaking, I do agree with you that it would not be as catastrophic as a lot of people make it out to be if we did have across-the-board legalization.
Yeah, there's definitely things that I'd be worried about too, but the real thing that the thing that I can't just get out of my mind though is, we already tried this once with the prohibition of alcohol, right? And everybody can see parallels to it these days.
Right.
The prohibition of alcohol, it was done for pretty much all the same reasons the drug war started. There was a lot of alcoholics at the turn of the century. A lot of women especially were getting fed up with it. This was during the original women's rights movement. The progressives were calling for it. The conservative Christians were calling for it. And people just thought that it was going to make society a better place. It would make people more productive. There'd be fewer people in prison. That there'd be fewer crime. All of the same things that we thought would result from banning drugs. But as we know, during Prohibition, all of the reverse was true, right? Crime went up, especially violent crime, right? It created, it was the era of the gangsters, right?
Right.
Al Capone, and bootleg liquor, and more people were dying from moonshine. They're going blind from drinking alcohol that was produced in a bathtub. So like all of the same things we can see with drugs as we did with alcohol prohibition. So it's almost like at this point we gotta just give it a try, right? And deal with there's positives and negatives obviously for legalizing everything, but it just seems like there's going to be a lot more positives. Like the net benefit will be much greater.
Sure. I think that, yeah. And, there's a really great quote that I like from Plato in Plato's Republic, which goes, I'm going to screw this up, but to paraphrase it grossly, it's good laws don't make bad men good, and bad laws do not make good men bad, right?
Yeah.
So having all these laws in place hasn't actually helped make anybody good. And removing all these laws, it won't actually take people who are good and make them bad. In this sense, we could say that the rate at which Americans or any group of people abuse drugs, the rate at which they do that is going to be tied back to the culture and to some degree to the economy, right? Because, a low economy might create greater levels of depression. So ultimately, legalization and decriminalization would have maybe only the impact of making the drug trade safer and moving it from being a black market to a white market.
Yeah, I think we would see a lot of the similar things that happened after the prohibition was repealed. Kind of going along with that Plato quote you said, that's like one of the things that people say when prohibition first hit, is the day before prohibition you had, perfectly law-abiding citizens, and then the day prohibition, went into effect, then, you had all of these people who turned into criminals overnight, right? They were criminals just for, drinking alcohol. And that, of course, has happened with drugs. These people are now all criminals. And that sort of, stigma, that kind of stigma that's kind of carried with it too, I think does have an effect on society.
Well, it does. I think it produces what they would say is a certain social cleavage where people feel like things they want to do put them outside of the law, and they care less collectively about the law, and they care less collectively about the systems that we have in place. You start seeing people think of themselves more as a community that exists apart from other communities and from the political body as a whole.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the other obvious effect would be that incarceration rates would go way down. There's a statistic here that nearly half of the 186,000 people in federal prisons, now these are federal prisons, not state prisons, so there's still a lot of other people in prison, but half of them are incarcerated on drug-related charges. So that incarceration rate that we were referring to previously would certainly come way down. And that's one of the things, especially for the Black community and Hispanic communities, they have been calling for this for quite some time.
Correct.
People are just getting into the system and never getting out of it. And as they say, once you go to prison once, you basically learn how to be a better criminal, and you come out, and typically the arrest, the re-incarceration rates are quite high, right? For these
and those
people.
are your connections now. Like, these are the people that you associate with. You expand the network of people you associate with. You can't find a job because you've been to prison. So the most obvious thing to do when you've been out of jail for 2 weeks and you don't have any source of income and no one will hire you is to go right back to grinding out a living in crime.
Exactly. Take your chances. Again, you can, as we were saying, you can make a lot of money or go back to prison. It's actually, when you think about it, not that bad of a choice for these people.
To play devil's advocate for a minute, though, I do agree that the incarceration rate would go down, but I've also considered that on some level you have to say the sort of people who did engage in crime and make a living in the easiest and dishonest way that they could, they might also just look to other forms of crime when it all goes legal. Like the hundreds of thousands of people that are involved in the black market drug trade today, of course, some of them would go completely legitimate, but as we all know, like these big cigarette companies actually have stakes in the growth of marijuana, and you're going to find actual businessmen being like, hey, this is legal now. We're going to be involved in it. And eventually you're going to have the drug market, as it goes legal, go into the hands of legal producers who have business models. And the sort of people that were making money from it may stop making money from it, and maybe they will go to looking towards other forms of crime. What would you think about that?
Well, I would say that one of your points is very good. The other one I think isn't. So the one where you said that, the market would just be cornered by the large companies. I don't think that's that great of a point because, again, that with alcohol, that's what happened, right?
Right.
We don't see, well, I guess these days microbreweries are actually the trend, but what we did see for most of the 20th century was, right, the large, Budweisers and Miller Lights cornering the market. Right. Now, I would say that you are right in that I think there's something that is different about drugs and alcohol in that, there never really was much like organic production of alcohol, I guess, and like private dealing of alcohol, right? Before Prohibition, right? It wasn't like people were getting their alcohol from the guy on the corner,
right?
Whereas drugs, there's so many different types of drugs, and there already is this established, network of like the corner drug dealer that, I think your point of will those guys just, stop suddenly? Yeah, they probably won't. But maybe then it becomes a price war. Like if you can get it cheaper from Walmart, maybe you don't go to the guy at the corner anymore.
Right, and you go to Walmart and you don't have to worry about any shady dealings at all. I mean, it's right.
Yeah.
If you have a choice between getting beer safe and cheap in a store or buying it from some guy who has gang affiliations in his backyard, I mean, where are you going to go buy your alcohol?
Yeah, even if the price is, I guess, close, right? You would still pay the higher price, right?
I will say this though, I've seen with some of the marijuana legalization, there are some of these guys who were black market growers before that have come together and they're developing their brand, but a whole lot of these guys are getting entirely pushed out and the profit margins are decreasing exponentially, right? So you are going to run into this situation where because if you can now go and buy marijuana legally grown on a 100-acre farm. That would be a small farm, right? 100-acre farm for such a small price. The guys that initially were able to make money off of it on the street corner because they took the risk and would sometimes go to jail for it, they're just not going to be making money anymore.
Yeah. I think one of the other points that should be made is a lot of people who called for like the legalization of drugs in like the 70s and 80s and stuff. What was that guy's name? Terrence McKenna. You know that guy?
Oh yeah.
Like that kind of guy. Guys who were experimenting with LSD and that kind of thing. That they were calling for the legalization of drugs because one of the points they made was that as the years go on, the drugs got more lethal, more potent, right? Like the weed from the 60s is much different than the weed these days. And that actually has happened, right? That has, come to fruition as, we're talking about fentanyl today, right? It's 100 times more potent than morphine. So there's like this this game where it just keeps getting more and more dangerous. So I don't know if we legalize all drugs, would people kind of go back to the organic, the plant-based, like less dangerous, weed and LSD, would magic mushrooms, would people kind of revert back to that, or would they kind of continue on this stairway up to, who knows what's next? We got elephant tranquilizers that are popular.
Well, yeah,
go ahead.
I think that's a really good point. I was reading some stories before on how people ended up abusing meth for the first time, and I was really shocked by the amount of people where it was completely incidental or accidental, where people were smoking meth, they saw it, they didn't want to really chicken out when it was offered to them, and they just kind of ran with it, right? And so it feels like it's almost arbitrary how people end up getting into really hardcore narcotics, and that if instead everything was more available and you had more choices, you would find the people who were interested in experimenting with drugs just going and getting, marijuana or maybe mushrooms and things like that much cheaper. And there wouldn't really be a market at all for guys that were selling meth so much.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. And if you look at that last chart there that says the percent of population who used a drug in the past year, I was actually kind of surprised at how low these numbers were. I mean, I don't know what you thought about it, but
yeah.
It says here that marijuana for white and blacks is around 10 to 12% of people only in the past year have used it. Whereas all the other harder drugs, cocaine, crack, heroin, hallucinogens, are under 2%. So this kind of graph, it does lead me to believe that perhaps if we did legalize all drugs, a lot of people, most people would stick to weed. There'd be, of course, other people that would experiment with some harder stuff. And I really think the people that are turning to like fentanyl would have a major decrease.
That's right. I would also point this out, kind of a strange thing to tack on here, but the number of ex-alcoholics that have gotten through their alcoholism by spending a year or two casually smoking marijuana is pretty astounding.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I believe DMT has been. It's one of the. It's either DMT or one of the drugs similar to that have shown that they have profound effects on alcoholics. Just after having one or two experiences, they can just cut alcohol cold turkey. Like the numbers are way, way, way higher than any other treatment. Right. I mean, this kind of gets us into, the whole like medical marijuana and medical drug usage conversation. It's slightly different, but yeah, there would be medicinal benefits of some of these drugs that are currently banned as well.
I knew a guy I knew a guy, I wouldn't have ever described him as an alcoholic, but he was a guy in his 20s who would drink and get drunk, just like most guys in his 20s. And he swears up and down that after he did, psilocybin, mushrooms for the first time, just once, he eventually went on to do it several more times. But after doing it the first time, he suddenly didn't have an urge to get drunk anymore. It was almost like flipping a light switch, right? Mm-hmm. And he swears that, if you do this, you will eventually, you will be in a position where that urge you had to drink that was so destructive could really just completely vanish.
Exactly. Yeah, I've heard similar stories. And I think really the point I guess we're getting at here with that would be there's a lot of other potential benefits and side effects that we can't really imagine right now that would come about from the legalization of all drugs. Now, again, of course, there would be some negative things that we can't imagine right now as well, but I just can't see it getting any worse, right? Like, is it really going to get worse than it is right now? And at least you could always then make the argument that, well, this is your choice. Like this is your choice, right? I think when drugs are illegal, this doesn't, I don't know if this makes much sense, but when drugs are legal compared to illegal, and people are fully aware of, how dangerous they are, like just let's say there's a label on the drug, right, that, Surgeon General's warning, if you take this overdose on this, you might die, that kind of thing. Personal responsibility, it really starts to kick in. If you wanna take hard drugs when they're legal and end up killing yourself, well, I guess that's your choice. Tough luck.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I really agree with you when you pointed out, like, well, could it get much worse, right? Like, I really think it could get much worse. I think we're at the pinnacle of suck right now. So, why not give it a shot? I'd also point out something quite interesting that I learned. One of my best friends is from Colombia, and just out of curiosity, I go, like, you're from the cocaine capital of the world. Like, what's your experience living in the cocaine capital of the world? And he said, like, he had one friend, just one friend out of all the friends he ever had in his life who did cocaine with some amount of regularity. And he said that the average person has nothing to do with cocaine or any hardcore narcotics in general. And that the average person as well, it sounded like he was even saying Colombians definitely drink less than Koreans, and they drink less than Americans, and that the average Colombian just isn't really much of a drug user or an alcoholic. And it has nothing to do with poverty either, because, you can get like $1, you got $1, you can get a bottle of alcohol in Colombia, and of course the prices of marijuana and other drugs are going to be much cheaper. And, while junkies do exist, it's just not on the level that you would imagine it to be for a country that already has so many issues with law enforcement, corruption, and drugs.
Yeah, well, just drug use in general does seem to be like more of an issue with nations like the U.S. and in wealthier nations. It does seem to be a bit of a cultural problem that you need wealth to deal with, right? Now, of course, there's certain types of... Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that I think that there's something about the atomization of really wealthy countries. When you generate so much wealth, individuals stop being so connected to their families. They start feeling really independent, and they really just want to pursue their own personal life. And I think that's where you really get attitudes that are more selfish and willing to take drugs, whether it's alcohol or marijuana or cocaine, in a way that basically is antisocial, right? Because you look at the Mediterranean countries versus the Northern European countries, where you've got Italians and Spaniards who drink alcohol just as frequently as British people, but they will get blackout drunk far less than British or Irish or Russian people, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's just something about the way that culture has developed and how there's this process of atomization in wealthier countries where you're alienated from others and you're much more willing to overindulge.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of it has to do with, extra spending money and free time, extra leisure time as well. I mean, Again, that's not... None of these factors are in and of themselves like the one factor of why you could say, the U.S. has a drug problem. But I think if you combine all of those things together, right, you have this, sort of ultimate situation where, the people can afford the drugs, the people have the time to take the drugs, the people, as you said, are a bit alienated from their families, or more independent, and you have this perfect storm, which is currently the U.S.
rates. Because you even look at the statistics, or the number of people who become drug addicts and go to jail. So many of them are from families where the father was never present. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a case where if your parents have divorced or your father wasn't present, you're going to have not just a strained relationship with your father who is not there, but also with your mother, feeling like she's failed you in some way. And so I think when you go to a more traditional society with lower divorce rates, there's really a sense of obligation to your parents. And I know that I felt that my entire life, and it's almost scary to think of the things that you might do if you were um, completely independent and didn't have a family to think about. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like in Korean society and East Asian society, that Confucianism is such a large has a large role in, bringing shame to your family, is still
Yeah.
it's still a thing, right? In the
Right.
U.S. in the U.S. People don't care about that, especially like you said, many people don't even have a family, or they have half of a family, or so there. The idea in Korea that if you become a drug addict and you would bring shame upon your family, that's a real thing still,
Right.
right? And that just doesn't exist in the U.S.
And I gotta say, shame can almost save lives. I mean, you look at the long-term results. You take a society that still has social pressures for people to keep their shit together and to go through life honestly and making good money. These are societies where you don't have 30,000 people a year dying of fentanyl abuse.
Yeah, like is like the honor societies, like many like
Right.
Middle Eastern societies, like societies that put large emphasis on bringing honor to yourself and your family and God and whatnot. Yeah, becoming a drug addict, brings shame and dishonor to. So it's the exact opposite. So
Right.
it's a very good point. Countries that have that honor aspect don't
And
have the drug problems typically.
I would even say that is exactly as you've said. We don't even have to talk about shame here. The second you say something's honorable, that means that things which are the opposite of it, especially and other things that fall short of it, are dishonorable. You can't have honor unless an element of shame exists.
Hmm.
So as a result, you have countries with you got Latin America with machismo, and you got the Middle East where the high levels of religiosity. In Persia, they refer to this as gerat, a sense of pride. When you have these things going around, people are able to rebound off of this sheer stubborn will. And another great thing to say about this, I think, is these are countries where it seems people are proud to say that their dad was an honest farmer, an honest fisherman. There's something really, when you have an honor culture, if someone's a good Catholic who went and did his construction job 9 to 5, just being a salt of the earth person is enough for everyone. And I feel like growing up in America, I did get that message a lot because, I'm thankful that I was raised in a conservative and down to earth Christian family. But you do see a lot of people growing up where the top priority is this keeping up with the Joneses, going to university and distinguishing yourself. And when you don't do that and you become something less, it feels like the honor kind of goes away. And as a
Yeah.
result, people who feel like they don't really have honor, they're going to be more likely, in my opinion, to fall into substance abuse or other forms of antisocial behavior.
Yeah, and I would just to add one thing to that too. I would say part of the thing to blame the U.S. for that is, in my opinion, the entertainment industry. Um,
Oh yeah,
you
yeah,
know, the kind of things that people see in TV and movies in the U.S., the kind of music, the kind of glorification of certain things like drugs and alcohol and you know women and that kind of thing. That that definitely also plays a part. Like many of the more traditional societies, they don't have that huge entertainment
right.
industry bombarding them with advertisements and you know um, have you listened to the latest album from such and such rapper, and are you watching Keeping with the Kardashians on
Yeah,
TV? Like you don't have that pressure, which it seems kind of silly because you're like, whatever, that stuff doesn't mean anything. But when you take all of it together and then you raise children in that environment, you're going to end up with a different outcome, obviously, than if you were in a more traditional society where again, dad is the fisherman and mom's, staying home taking care of you, and you're barely watching any TV, and you're spending time talking with each other, that sort of thing.
Right.
That sort of society, yeah, they're not going to have drug problems.
And I can say this as well as I've been blown away at how extroverted and hypersocial Persians and also Koreans can be. Koreans not, Korea's really been modernized, but you still see it a bit where the whole direction of the individual is into the family. And as growing up as an American in a very modern atmosphere, it was just so common to be like, I'm going to go home and I'll just play video games or stare at a computer screen for several hours an evening. And Saturday, you do that for 7 hours and then you go meet somebody. But as I've always seen the Iranian household operate, you got family visiting every single weekend. You've got your cousins coming over on a weeknight, and everyone sits around, drinks tea, and socializes. It's not really acceptable for you to go off into your room for hours on end and do nothing. You're supposed to be included in the family. And you see it as such a problem in the United States that we had these big movements and announce, you'd have these people in the 90s and 2000s always saying, you should try to eat at least 2 meals a week with your family at the table together.
Yeah.
And like 2 meals a week, that's so small. In almost all these other countries, everyone is going to sit down together and eat together. The concept of eating in front of the TV separately, it's not even a model that is acceptable.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more accountability there that like the family members keep each other accountable, as you're saying,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. If you even want to think about becoming the black sheep, right? That you're going to have to, you're going to have to hear it from grandpa and grandma and mom and dad, right? So it's not even worth it, right?
That's right. I have met one of I won't identify them at all, but I'll say this. I've met 3 or so Koreans in the punk and metal scene here in South Korea, Korean Americans, that it basically came out over the course of months that as adults, their Korean family in the U.S. sent them to South Korea to get clean from drugs. Like, we are not tolerating what you've done here in America. You're going to go to South Korea and live with your grandparents for a couple of years. You're going to be an honest person there, and then you come back.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of stories like that. A lot of Korean guys go to the U.S. and they end up being, kind of like black sheeps of the family because like they get out of, in Korea there's this sense, and it is sort of true, right? There's this sense that they're suffocated a bit by the culture, and
right.
That they're not able to be individuals, which again, there's positives and negatives of this. We're just talking about like all the positives of it. There are some negatives, and a lot of Koreans want to get out of Korea for that reason. And then when they do get out of Korea, right? It's, well, all hell breaks loose, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say that you just got to look at the numbers in that, yeah, you do have some negative numbers. The suicide rate is slightly higher, but if you include all the people who kill themselves through drugs and alcohol in the U.S., I would think that the U.S. would have far worse numbers than Korea. And you look at crime rates, but even just look at Koreans in the United States and other conservative cultures in the U.S., the list of foreign cultures or second-generation Americans from those cultures that make more than the average American, have higher educational attainment, it's through the roof. And it's the same everywhere. You go to any town in the U.S., you could walk into their local family practice doctor or go to see, who are the lawyers, who are the professors at the University of Montana. You would see an overrepresentation of East Asian and Middle Eastern and Indian cultures, right?
Yep. Yeah. Indians, Asian Indians, make the most money out of any any racial group in the entire United States.
Oh yeah.
And
I
that's not just by chance, right? That's because of the culture, you know.
Oh yeah. I heard a really great story. We probably should wrap up soon. This will be my last story. One of my buddies, he is from a well-off Indian family from the Marathi area. Well, he's a Marathi from I can't say the name of the region, but it's around Mumbai. He's from that area. But his family has a traditional village where his grandpa's basically kind of the default headman there. And he was saying that in his village, there was a young guy in his 20s. He's married, he's got a young wife with a kid, and he really likes to distill his own liquor and drink it. It's something that they let anyone do. But this guy really became an alcoholic. He wasn't showing up to do any of the regular tasks he would do to keep his family afloat. He basically was abandoning his wife and his child to get drunk, most of the week and be hungover and useless. This guy's parents weren't really in the picture to help him. They got all these other kids, and someone's got to do something. So my friend's, 70-year-old grandfather, who's just this respected, elder, and he's like the kshatriya, the higher caste in the village, he just goes with some young men one day, goes, come on with me. They go, they find this guy, they go out to his personal still where he distills his liquor out in wherever he kept it in the forest. They break it. They go to his house, they break all of his alcohol. They basically publicly humiliate him and beat him with sticks for a while. All of this is all of this is completely illegal, right? Because you're allowed to drink alcohol in India and all of this. Some guy can't come and break your stuff and beat you with a stick because you're getting drunk too much. Uh-huh. But, this is village law. And in the end, because they took all of these steps, the guy just was like, well, they're going to beat me up if I do this. And I guess I'm just going to get my life together and be a good husband and be a productive member of my village. And the guy completely turned his life around. But in the U.S. and in modern societies, you don't have this safety net. You don't have angry Indian grandpa coming, kicking your butt, and making you stop being a heroin addict. And while there would be these fringe cases of tragedy of the Indian grandpa who went too far and killed a guy, I think that, by and large, you would find 9 times out of 10, or more like, 99 times out of 100, the Indian grandpa who beats up a guy and keeps him from destroying his life through alcohol or whatever, he's doing his community a service, and the only loss is some guy got a bunch of his alcohol, destroyed.
All right, well, Verv, that was a pretty great story there. Thanks for sharing. I guess we can maybe just end right on that point then. The Indian grandpa story.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you have anything else you want to say before we call it?
I think that is all. I would just like to thank everybody for listening.
Yep. Thank you again. If you have listened to this point, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for next week's episode. See ya.